Now it's a great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Roger Milliken. Roger has spent a long time living and working in Maine, always with a strong interest in the past, present, and future of Maine's forests. For more than a century, his family has owned land in the Baskahegan Valley in Washington County. He first visited there 45 years ago. It's been an important part of his world ever since. Roger wrote a wonderful history of the region and his family's company, a book titled Forest for the Trees, a history of the Baskahegan Company that was first published in '83 and a later edition about, I guess, 5 years ago. I'd hold up the book. It's a wonderful one, but I have it at home where I am reading it sort of page by page. It's got such rich stuff like great maps and things that I'm not speeding my way through it, but it's very special. I meant to ask you, Roger, is that book still available online? Like people can just read it there? Cool, so you can get it for free at the Baskahegan Company's website. He's played many other leadership roles in Maine, including via his work with the Maine chapter of the Nature Conservancy to protect 185,000 acres along the St. John River and the 40,000 acre Baskaghegan Lakes wilderness area. I've paddled the Baskaghegan. I highly recommend it. I haven't made it down the St. John yet, but it's been calling me for years. So Roger, thanks for your role in all of that. As you'll see today, Roger has a deep ethical commitment to the natural world and, among other things, to the indigenous communities whose lifeways are inseparable from that world. So we have a lot of common interests with Roger, not only because of UMaine's extraordinary group of Wabanaki faculty and students, some who are in the room with us today, but also because of the important work that people like Don Beath in the back are doing. He's in philosophy and other UMaine faculty to address the many important ethical dimensions of sustainability challenges. So it's a delight to have Roger here with us. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Dave, for that warm introduction. And thank you all for coming, and those online as well. Since I'll be talking about our relationship with the natural world, I'd like to begin by inviting you to feel your own. Please sit comfortably. Feel your seat in the chair, your feet on the floor. Let your eyes gently close. Take a moment to let the world drop away as you focus on how your belly lifts and falls with each breath. Imagine yourself in a place in nature where you feel at home. Let yourself enter fully into that place. What sounds do you hear? What are the smells? Is there a breeze? What season is it? Settle in. Feeling held by this place, imagine that it has ears to hear. If you were to say one thing to this place to express what's in your heart, what might it be? Remember this. Now, trusting whatever comes, imagine that this place has one thing to say to you. What is it? Trust whatever comes. Let it rise like a bubble through water. Remember this too. Take a few more moments to become complete, to thank your special place. Open your eyes and return to this room this afternoon, November 28th, is it? And I invite you to continue to feel your connection that you just touched as I speak. It has become customary to begin a session like this by acknowledging that we are on the unceded territory of the Penobscot Indian Nation, which we are. Earlier this year, I heard Rick Hill, a Tuscarora artist and scholar from Six Nations Canada, take it a step further. He began not with a land acknowledgement, but with what he called a land atonement. He said, "We acknowledge that we have failed to uphold our responsibility to the land. Because of our collective conduct, the air is often unbreathable. The waters have become polluted. A large number of animal, plant, and bird species have disappeared. The soil has been depleted and filled with toxins. Climate change brought on by human arrogance is on the verge of destroying life on Earth. To our mother, the Earth, we apologize and commit to returning the land to those who can better care for it." It's a lot to take in. Let us imagine what those who can better care for it might mean. This afternoon, I'll reflect on my experience caring for 150,000 acres of forest in Baskahegan, a company founded by my grandfather. Now that I'm retired, I feel less torn by and therefore more free to talk about the conflicts between economics and care for nature. I'll invite you into a frank exploration of the tensions between Western culture and the continuation of our lives on Earth. I delve into this because I believe that to find solutions, we need to candidly face the causes of the mess we have made. We are living in a time of apocalypse. You know the litany. 500-year floods coming every few years. 1/3 of Pakistan flooded and millions displaced. Intense droughts and catastrophic wildfires in Australia and the American West. Last year, on the coast of British Columbia, heat waves that actually cooked marine animals in their shells. With the exceptions of Hurricane Irene and Superstorm Sandy, we in New England have not yet suffered as dramatically from climate change as others have elsewhere. Having spent my life in the woods of Maine, however, it was heartbreaking to read last year's projection out of Vermont that, given current trends, by 2050, well within the lifespan of most in this room, the songs of hermit thrushes will no longer uplift us as we walk through the woods, and the yodels of loons will no longer bring the thrill of wildness to the waters of the northern forest. It will be too hot. The word apocalyptic fits these times, and not only in its sense of catastrophic. A friend shared with me her experience of California's Thomas Fire. When it burned nearly 300,000 acres in 2017, it was the largest wildfire in the state's history. Now, less than 5 years later, it ranks only 7th on that list. Shay lived in Ojai, a wide valley in Southern California. That night, she walked a ridge on the land she was caring for. Looking to the east, she saw flames soaring into the sky, propane tanks exploding in communities the fire had engulfed. Turning to the west, her gaze rested on a nearly full moon shining in a wide, star-flecked sky. She heard the words, "This is the world we were given." Turning east again to behold the towering wall of flames and smoke, she heard, "And this is the world we have made." This is the other root meaning of apocalypse, the removal of a veil that has obscured the truth. Now, if we choose to look, we can see what we have done and continue to do. How much has already unraveled? How much more will we continue to destroy? Why? I view our heedless rush toward the destruction of nature as a direct result of Western worldviews based in individualism, separation, and dominion. These views drive our economic system to convert to cash as much of nature as possible, with little thought for the effects on future generations of humans, let alone the more than human world of which we are but a small part. What do I mean by separation and dominion? My sixth great grandfather on my father's side arrived in Boston in the late 1600s, a Scots-Irish refugee fleeing poverty and religious persecution. His son John moved to Scarborough, Maine in 1719, shortly after that territory had been declared to be safe, meaning that the native peoples had been killed or driven out. The first major conflict there had been sparked in 1675. That year, English sailors saw a mother canoeing her small child across the Saco River. They had heard that Indian children had the innate ability to swim from birth, and to test it, they deliberately capsized the canoe. The child, who happened to be the son of a local chief, sank. His mother dove down and brought him to the bank, where the little one died. The sailors had viewed the mother and child as mere curiosities, not fellow humans. They were separate, others, and the sailors presumed their unquestioned dominion over them, at least until the outraged natives torched the English settlement the next day. Of course, the settlers also saw the lands and waters as other, to which they had rights, but to which they bore no responsibilities. They choked off fish runs with dams to power the grinding of grain and to saw into lumber the abundant pine felled from local forests. Decades earlier, when Chief Poland, a Wabanaki leader, walked all the way to Boston to plead for fishways at the new dams, he did not speak from separation and dominion. He began his request to Governor Belcher by saying, "I have something to say about the river which I belong to." How might it have been, I wonder, if my ancestors had arrived without the presumption that they were God's chosen people? If they had not been steeped in the language of Genesis, that God created man in his own image and said unto them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth on the earth. Dominion over the sea, the air, the earth. And if that weren't enough, settlers were encouraged by their rulers and religious leaders to kill or convert the natives and seize their lands. After all, the natives were not Christian. Since they focused on the web of life and not solely on a God in heaven separate from it, they were reviled as pagans, dismissed as ignorant and primitive. How would it have been if, instead of acting out of superiority, those early settlers had asked with humility, curiosity, and respect, what does it take to live well in a place like this? After all, they were greeted by the descendants of people who had done just that for about 12,000 years. If John had asked, and if he had had the patience to listen long enough, he likely would have heard statements like this from Chief Oren Lyons of the Onondaga Nation in what we now call New York. Representing the traditional circle of Native American elders at the UN in 1982, Chief Lyons said, "We are nourished by our mother, the earth, from whom all life springs. We must understand our dependence and protect her with our love, respect, and ceremonies. We are part of the great cycle of life with endless renewal. When we disturb this cycle, the effects may be immediate or may fall upon our children who will suffer and pay for our ignorance and greed." On another occasion, Chief Lyons described more plainly the workings of what he calls the natural law. The law says if you poison your water, you'll die. The law says if you degrade where you live, you'll suffer. He adds, there's no negotiation with this law. My ancestor John might also have heard the wisdom that suffuses the writings of Potawatomi plant ecologist Robin Wall Kimmerer. She identifies the principles of the honorable harvest, which, she wrote, govern our taking, shape our relationships with the natural world, and rein in our tendency to overconsume, that the world might be as rich for the seventh generation as it is for our own. These principles are part of oral traditions conveyed by practice and carried by stories. But if they were written down, she says, they would likely include, take only what you need. Harvest in a way that minimizes harm. Never take more than half. Never waste what you have taken. Sustain the ones who sustain you, and the earth will last forever. But even if John and his fellow settlers had listened, embedded as they were in European worldviews and surrounded by abundance ripe for the taking, they likely could not have resisted exercising their God-given dominion to extract wealth. For many generations, things went well for people like my ancestors. John became a farmer and sawmill owner. Settlements spread, and the newcomers busily harvested riches from the lands and waters. Taken first from the main woods was the magnificent old-growth white pine. Coming upon a towering pine, timber cruisers felled another tree against it and used it to ladder up into the crown. From that perch, they took a bearing on other pines soaring above the canopy. They felled the original tree, moved to the ones they had sighted, and did the same. Soon, every large pine near any drivable watercourse was gone. Waves of similar extraction followed. First, old growth spruce for lumber, then hemlock for tanneries, then hardwood trees for tool handles and boxes for fruit. And at the turn of the last century, the birth of the American paper industry in Maine saw loggers sweep through the woods, cutting 4-foot pulp and flushing it downstream to the mills. The rivers were choked with bark, sawdust, and mill effluent. But who cared? To my ancestors, this was progress. These natural resources were there for the taking, and take they did. Americans were extracting untold riches. My grandfather, Garish, continued in the textile business his father had founded in Maine in 1865. In 1920, Garish bought 100,000 acres of timberland. However, with the purchase of Baskahegan, he reaped what had been sown by a century of exploitation. Continuing the ethic of wealth extraction, he had planned to cut the land hard to recoup his investment. But only 6 years into a 15-year contract with the local paper mill, he ran out of wood. A later cruise of softwood stands found an average of only 2 cords per acre on land that once held 40 cords per acre. After that cruise, my elders faced the choice of whether to sell the depleted forest or hold on. Fortunately, the family textile company provided enough income that they could choose to wait a full 3 decades for the forest to grow back. After that, my dad was determined not to experience the bust of a boom and bust cycle ever again. And it took considerable persuasion for him to even cut another tree. Researching the history of Baskahegan, I talked with old timers, snow melting off my boots onto the floors of their kitchens, as they regaled me with stories of peeling pulp in swarms of black flies and jumping into chest-deep streams, ice chunks floating by, the picaroon pulpwood into the current. Most illuminating, I spent time in the woods with foresters. Yale forestry professor Dave Smith, who advised our family for over 40 years, hinted at a felicitous marriage of economics and nature when he explained to me that forestry was a kind of applied ecology. I learned that by observing how a forest grew when left alone, foresters of a natural forest like ours could use that knowledge to work with nature, removing in initial harvest shorter-lived or smaller trees, reducing competition, and thus increasing the nutrients and sunlight flowing to the dominant, and I use the word advisedly, dominant trees. In my father's mind, we were rebuilding the value and productivity of the resource. In mine, we were helping the forest heal from past abuses. There was no conflict between these two. In the late 1980s, I made a pilgrimage to the office of every large landowner in Maine willing to speak with me. My question was simple. What kind of returns could forest management generate over time? I spoke with families who had owned timberland for generations, as well as the paper companies who controlled 1/3 Maine. Their answers fell in a relatively narrow band, from a low of 2% to a high of 4%. 2% per year. I had begun work at Baskahegan in the early 1980s, when interest rates on ultra-safe treasury bills approached an annual rate of 18%. I wondered how returns of 2 to 4% could possibly satisfy the 20 other members of my generation. Knowing that we were all graduates of the first birthday in 1970, I brought as many of them to the land as I could, so we could inhale together the fragrance of the fir, hear loons calling across undeveloped lakes, and see directly the care we were bringing to the forest. My goal was to invite them to feel connection with and responsibility for these lands and waters. My generation's environmental ethic, along with my father's determination to rebuild the productivity of the forest, seemed to assure a special place for Baskahegan in the family's investment portfolio. My early career took place in the shadow of the spruce budworm infestation that led to immense clear cuts on paper company lands. Following that liquidation, industrial spokesmen touted the millions of dollars being invested in herbicides and pre-commercial thinning to accelerate the growth of the new young forest. This threw into high relief that Baskahegan was making a harder to quantify investment in our forest, one of restraint. We cut fewer trees then in order to provide for more abundant harvests in the future. In a family company, after all, future generations are not an abstraction. We changed their diapers, helped them learn how to read, and climb mountains together. Over time, industry practice advanced beyond a simplistic focus on sustained yield. Successful campaigns out west to protect ancient forests and the spotted owls who lived in them spurred Maine's industry to collaborate with the environmental community to define biodiversity-friendly forest practices that supported the health of all aspects of the forest. To do so, we drew on a natural science that was likewise moving beyond a utilitarian focus on the species we like to hunt or harvest to give attention to whole ecosystems. Our profession appeared to be widening our circle of care. Then in the mid-1990s, financial wizards on Wall Street convinced the paper companies that their forests were, and I kid you not, unproductive assets. More than a third of Maine changed hands as a new category of landowners arrived. They were strictly financially driven and had neither the multi-generational perspective of family owners nor the paper industry's commitment to a non-declining supply of wood. I remember the first Timber Investment Management Organization, or TIMO, proclaiming to Mainers that they were long-term investors. Less than 5 years later, they had sold their lands. The genius of TIMOs was that they recognized values in the forest that had yet to be monetized. Where the paper companies had seen only a source of fiber, TIMO saw a shorefront that could be developed for second homes. This caused a new wave of extraction and wealth capture to crash through the Maine woods. For Maine citizens, it threatened a century-long tradition of paper companies providing access for hunting, fishing, and camping throughout their lands in the Northwoods. When Mainers rose up against the loss of recreational opportunities they had enjoyed for a lifetime, the TIMOs pivoted and sold the most valuable lands to state government and conservation organizations. over 3 decades, more than $1.1 billion, 2/3 of it private philanthropy, went into the pockets of TIMOs and other landowners to protect these public values. TIMOs lived the investor's dream of buying low and selling high. The TIMO model shifted financial expectations everywhere. In 1998, Baskahegan hired an appraiser to value our lands. He included a financial analysis based on an expected rate of return of 6 to 9%. Remembering my earlier conversations with long-term landowners, I was taken aback. Where do those numbers come from? I asked. He answered blandly, not blinking an eye. That's what the market demands. There I was, face to face with a market demanding a financial return completely divorced from the actual biological rate of return. I heard it again last year when the leader of a TIMO that promises investors sustainable forest management say, again, if it was the most unremarkable thing in the world, when prices go down, we just increase the harvest. At Baskahegan, we do the opposite, delaying the harvest of quality trees, knowing that they will keep growing in size and value while we wait for the markets to recover. Despite our longstanding culture of restraint, the pressure for higher returns crept into our family as well. In one meeting, a shareholder, perhaps because he had not lived the agonizing experience of facing a depleted forest, declared, "This asset ought to be able to produce 15% per year." He shook his head when I talked of limited returns, as if I just wasn't trying hard enough to wring profit from the resource. Why did my face flush, my heart pound in my chest? Why did I feel like I was committing financial heresy to simply state the biological truth, or put another way, the natural law? I felt torn between arbitrary financial pressure and our lived experience of the land. Why is it so hard to accept the observation of economist Herman Daly, who said, "The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment and not the reverse"? This brings us back to mistaken views of separation and dominion. To sacrifice forest health on the altar of profit diminishes the ability of both the forest and its owners to thrive. It leads directly to climbing a ridge where we look at the moon and the night sky and see, this is the world we were given. And then look at the approaching conflagration and know, this is the world we have made. I think back to Dave Smith's applied ecology. It is possible to have a marriage of economic activity with the health of the forest, but only if that ecology recognizes us as part of, not separate from, our life support system. Whether we think of it as natural law or my family's lived experience, or the daily evidence in the climate news, there are dire consequences when our appetites exceed what nature can freely give. For centuries, my people have proclaimed the superiority of our intelligence, our worldviews, our sophisticated science. Fortunately, that science continues to advance from above ground ecology to now uncovering the heretofore unseen webs of mycelia that connect all trees in a stem, sharing nutrients in a web of mutual thriving. As researcher Susan Simard says, it's not winner take all, but give and take. The reciprocity she has documented presents what she calls an evolutionary paradox, that individuals are not separate from, but instead require the thriving of the communities of which they are a part. This calls into question Darwinian notions of the survival of fittest individuals, fittest species, and even the idea of dominant trees. If my fifth great-grandfather John had asked and had been able to listen, he would have heard from his Wabanaki neighbors that we have responsibilities to nature as much as we have rights. That we must study nature and use what we learn to assure the well-being of both her and us. If John and his contemporaries had restrained their appetites, he and we would have captured less wealth. But surely it's time to rethink wealth capture as the ultimate metric. For centuries, Euro-Americans assured ourselves as our manifest destiny swept around the world that we were winning, we were getting richer, and that therefore we must be the smartest, the most fit, the ones most favored by God. Now, as climate chaos lifts the veil, fires, floods, and extinctions show us what happens when we choose extraction of wealth over the well-being of the communities of which we are a part. If the accelerating apocalypse is not enough, consider these illuminating statistics. Indigenous peoples make up something like 7% of the world's population. They have effective control of roughly 20% of the world's land. And that 20% supports 80% of the world's biodiversity. 80%, a biodiversity that includes hermit thrushes and loons. In the face of these facts, whose culture is ignorant and primitive? Who best understands what it takes to live well in this place, on this planet? When I remember how speechless I was when it came time to assert that there were biological limits to the financial return from Baskahegan's forest, I can't blame our current condition only on ancestors like John of Scarborough. Given the present apocalypse in both senses of the word, why does it feel like heresy to question the current blind consensus that perpetual economic growth is required despite the limits of a finite planet? Or that investors should demand market rates of return when those historic rates are the results of extraction, exploitation, and the externalizing of costs onto society and nature? Why is it so difficult to speak truth to the power of Wall Street, of experts, of family members? But change is possible. I think of celebrating the removal of a dam to restore passage for fish on the Penobscot River in 2012. When state and federal dignitaries spoke to the large crowd assembled on the banks of the river, it struck me that a similar crowd had likely gathered in the 1830s to dedicate what they called the Great Works Dam. This time, however, the voices of tribal leaders were prominent. One can imagine Chief Poland's approval of the dam's removal. One speaker put it well when he said, "We say we are breaching a dam. What we are really doing is repairing a breach." Over 180 years, our approach to the river had changed 180 degrees. As the writer Ursula Le Guin observed, we live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. She continued, any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. To conclude on another hopeful note, in my final year at the company, Baskahegan entered the carbon market, making a binding 100-year commitment to not diminish the volume of trees that we had carefully built up over the previous 40 years, an inventory that is well above that on neighboring lands owned by Timos and others. Since old timers had told me in their kitchens how 100 years ago, men shoveled snow away from the trunks of trees, felled them with buck saws, and moved them with horses, I am acutely aware of how presumptuous it is to predict what the world will be like a century from now. What enabled my family to make this commitment? First, the sale represented the only time that we had been rewarded financially for the restraint we had exercised, the trees we had left to grow while our neighbors were cutting theirs. Second, as a multi-generational family enterprise, Baskahegan values the well-being of our children and grandchildren as much as we do our own. And third, we believe that a commitment to retain the carbon stored in our forest and to sequester more to make the world of 2122 livable is in the best interest of us and all with whom we share this planet, human and more than human. For our family, ever since that decision to hold back for 30 years while the forest regrew, Baskahegan has been about more than short-term financial gain. And we continue to evolve to take better care of the small part of the earth entrusted to us. It's hard not to notice that almost no other commercial forest landowners in Maine have committed similarly to capture and store carbon. How can the market not demand a stable climate and resilient web of life? Now that you've walked with me for a while, let me leave you with a few questions. As we climb the ridge, comparing the world we were given to the destruction we continue to wreak, will we embrace and live the now evident truth that thriving can't just be individual, but that all true thriving must be mutual? Will we summon the courage to battle worldviews that prioritize financial return over the web of life of which we are a part and on which we depend? Moving beyond individualism, separation, and dominion, and away from the cold financial calculations that support them, and living instead from gratitude, love, and care? Will we deploy ourselves in service to the earth who gives birth to us, sustains us, and at the end will receive us back into her body? These are the questions I carry. I offer them to you, and I thank you for your kind attention. There she is.
What a wonderful, wonderful talk. Everyone, can we, whether you're sitting at home or you're sitting somewhere else, can we give another clap just in terms of this terrific talk that we've just heard? Really, really so interesting. And one of the things that I think is just so helpful for all of us is to hear your family history and to hear how you built, helping us understand things by sharing that important history and the steps and sort of what's gone on and the kinds of responses, and helping us learn from history. Do you have thoughts as you think through not just your family, but in other ways about how we ought to learn from history? Strategies that you think we're not using that we might want to use to learn about history so we don't create the kinds of challenges that we have?
Well, there's a big question.
But there are historians here sitting here and they say, I want to go back to my class and tell them about this.
To me, I feel like as I was pulling these thoughts together, it's the connection between the history and the present
Mhm.
that's hard to look at. You know, there's that saying that a fish doesn't know it's swimming in water. We don't know the conceptual framework that we swim in and take for granted. And yet history shows us how it plays out across the landscape. You know, what I try to do and what I encourage people to do is to look at our present, see how it's tied to the history, and then try to disentangle what are some of the threads in that history that led to this present that we would be well not to continue.
Very, very interesting, very helpful. One of the audience members, resonating to some of the things that you said, I've always held this belief in my teaching in the classroom and work in adaptation practices and approaches by including our epistemology and cosmology of the Wabanaki culture. We can learn from each other. We cannot think of any place, I cannot think of any place I would rather live but Maine. So this whole idea that's central to what you're talking about is this question of how do we learn from each other? Do you have thoughts as you meet with students and students learn about your work about strategies that we should all be thinking about how we can learn from each other across generations, across families, across different worlds? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm reading a book right now, and I'm not going to remember the full title. It's An Immense Something, Life, maybe by Ed Young, where he's describing the science in terms of understanding other creatures in biology. Like our view of vision is totally determined by how vision is for us. And, you know, we have three colors that combine to create the immensity of the world we live in. Many creatures have four colors or more. And he's just outlining again and again and again how our presumptions that how we see the world are how the world is. And I mention that because when it comes to cross-cultural learning, I think it can't primarily come from our heads and our assumptions that the way we've always seen the world are how the world is. And I feel, the deepest learning that I have had with Indigenous people has come when I've been on their territory, been invited in to, say, sit around the fire and listen as their elders speak the way they would. And it eclipses my own, it has eclipsed my own preconceptions. And in that, I think true learning can begin.
Mhm. That's very helpful. One of the important points that you made over and over again is that we need to pay attention to stories. And one of the challenges I think universities sometimes have is they see stories over here and facts over here, not realizing that the two are really important to together. Have you seen this, and do you have thoughts about that?
Well, you can tell by the words I just delivered that I worked in writing it into embed everything in story to the degree that I could, and not to start from grand notions of things, but to, be talking about the concrete experience, even experiences that I hadn't felt except in my imagination, like the capsizing of the canoe.
Mhm.
And I met with Don before this talk. I found him to be a very approachable philosopher. Usually my experience with philosophers is pretty soon we're in the castles in the air of abstract notions, and I just lose my connection entirely. So stories for me are how I learn and how I think the world changes, including the Genesis story, for example. And
Actually, one of the questions, let's see if I can pull this up from the audience, is in terms of, you mentioned Genesis and stuff. The question was, do you think the Christian religious tradition and Western culture in general, as you outlined them through history and story, are in conflict with sustainable ecological principles that you outlined?
well, it's which Christian traditions. It reminds me of, the person who asked Gandhi, what do you think about Western civilization? And Gandhi's response was, I think it would be a good idea. And clearly there's this tension in any tradition where you have the genius of the insight that is revolutionary, and then the power structure adapts to shape it, control it, make it safe for the power structure. And, when I talked about rulers and religious leaders, I was thinking of the papal bulls from the 1500s, where the Pope specifically said, go to these lands, kill the people who live there, take their lands, enslave them. It's hard to imagine Jesus saying anything like that. But there you had an immense power structure that was really literally dividing up the world, which of course is why they speak Portuguese in Brazil and Spanish everywhere else in Latin America. So I'm dodging your question, but
no, this is very important and very helpful. One other one, which is the Mitchell Center is extremely lucky to have you as head of the board and helping move things forward. What do you see the Mitchell Center should be doing in terms of all these important points that you've raised? Are there things that you would like to sort of bring a few ideas to the table to say, maybe think about doing this, or maybe think about doing that?
Well, just to clarify, I'm not on the board of the Mitchell Center. I've gotten to know David
My apologies. Yes,
over the years, and
yes.
so I'm not that close to the center. But my encouragement would be to ask the really tough questions.
Okay.
How do
And
we
my
get into this
apologies
mess?
too. Yeah.
How do we get out of this mess? And you know, one of the orthodoxies is that we can't think of things that are not market-based as solutions. And there was a question I saw on the screen about, you know, how can other forest landowners be inspired to do the right thing? And you know, I would say my experience of 40 years where I had hopes that there was going to be that kind of inspiration. I feel like the financial incentives or requirements that I described prevent the kind of care that we've tried to practice at Baskahegan. And so given that the market is about extraction, and I mean, you think about efficiency, which markets are so good at enacting. How do you define that? It's how do we get the most in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of effort? And if that isn't a description of what's going to destroy the planet, I don't know what is. So this very notion that markets have to be at the basis of everything we do, I think has created the mess we're in. And I hope the Mitchell Center takes it on.
We are just so lucky to have you as our speaker for the end of the semester so that we can all continue to think about what we've learned, how we agree with you, how we disagree with you, how we can have good conversations with you about the future. And the people who are here, hopefully every single person, there are lots of questions we didn't get to, but hopefully every single person, they may not be able to have the discussion with you, but they can have the discussion with in their classrooms, with people they care about, because this is about all of us, and you've helped us see that in your careful use of stories, your careful use of examples, your ability to take specific things and bring them broadly to their important implications. David, I know we're nearly out of time, but do you have anything that you wanted to add?
So, Linda, thanks as always. There may be several questions here, but I've invited people to come up and ask Roger at the end. So I think we're at time, and I just want to thank Roger one more time for a really powerful